Today I want to talk to you about some of the older Norway spruces, dwarf ones. My main book I'm using is Small Conifers for Small Gardens. This is the first book that I wrote. And I will also be referring to Special Conifers for Special Gardens, Volume 1, A Historical Perspective. I did a section in here on Hornibrook and the spruces that he wrote about, where I repeated some of the things he said and then also added a bunch of my own comments. Now, the first one I want to talk about a little bit is Picea abies Clanbrassiliana. And in Small Conifers, that's covered on page 119. And there's a picture of it at Gimborne Pinetum and a picture of it at Stenosium Gardens. Now, one of the things about Picea abies Clanbrassiliana is it was really the first of the dwarf conifers to be named. And it was found back in about 1780, and the original plant can still be seen on an estate, I believe it's in Ireland. My introduction to Clanbrassiliana occurred in the 1970s. I started collecting conifers in around 1974 or 75, and I had gotten a nursery license with the idea of eventually selling conifers, and I also wanted to deal with a nursery in New Jersey called Vermeulen's Nursery, and they're at Neshannock Station. And I got a mailing from them saying they had these overgrown plants for sale. So now I looked at them, and they had a number of Picea abies. And they had some Clanbrassiliana and repens and Pseudoprostrata, Remontii, a number of the old cultivars. And they had them in 3 and 5 gallon containers. And the Clanbrassiliana that they had were almost 3 feet across. They were just so badly overgrown. In fact, all these were badly overgrown. But I took them because they were cheap. Took them back to Lehighton, Pennsylvania, planted them out, and when I planted them out, I had to cut the pot off, and then I took a sharp knife and I slashed the ribbons out of the root mass. I mean, it's just so tight, it's unreal. And after I slashed them real good, I put them in the ground, and they thrived. And the Clanbrassiliana was developing into a globose bush, and it was growing a couple inches a year. But I noticed that it didn't really fit the descriptions in the books. At the time, I was using Denowden and Boom, and Denowden and Boom described it as being a much slower grower than that. Well, I went over to Gimborne Arboretum in the mid-1980s. I went there with Dick Van Huey Smith. We were traveling together, visiting different arboretum in Holland, and I came across this real dense Picea abies. It must have been 8 feet tall and almost 8 feet wide, and it was a very dense mound. And the growth rate was about 1 inch a year. And I looked at it and talked to the curator and Dick, and here was one of several Picea abies Clanbrassiliana that were growing at the Gimborne Pinetum. And so I looked at it, and I looked around the back of it, and I saw this faster growth. And it looked identical to what I was growing as Clanbrassiliana in the United States. And so what was happening was that in the United States, we were growing this faster form of Clanbrassiliana under the name Clanbrassiliana. But it was not the correct growth for it. It had reverted in more like a pseudo-Clanbrassiliana or some such thing. Eventually, I was able to get some cuttings from original plants at the Gimborne Pinetum, propagated them, and I was able to offer Clanbrassiliana the true form. I have rooted it and I have grafted it. It does root, but it's kind of interesting. It seems to make a tighter plant when it's grafted, which is really weird because normally when you graft Picea abies, you accelerate them. But this one, if you're a conifer collector, you really should have Clanbrassiliana in your collection because it was the first of the dwarf conifers to be named. Now on page 27 in my volume 1, I talk about Clanbrassiliana also, and just kind of a description of it, and mention here that it was discovered about 1780 on the Moira estate near Belfast, Northern Ireland, and Lord Clanbrassil took it to Tollymore in County Down, where in 1920 it was about 10 feet or 3 meters high. And it can still be seen growing on Tollymore Park in Northern Ireland. So there's an old-time cultivar that's still around. Now another interesting plant that I have grown and I like to talk about is Picea abies Ellwangeriana. Now Ellwangeriana was found about 1890, and I talk about it in my small conifer book on page 122, and I devote a full page to it. I have a couple pictures of it. It is a nice plant. I really like it because it grows very dense and is narrowly conical if it's grown on its own roots. If it's grafted, it grows quite a bit faster. It does not stay as tight, and it will have a lot more coarse growth in it. In fact, in my volume 1 of special conifers, talk about Ellwangeriana, and Hornibrook says that it really reverts very badly, and that as of 1938, it was no longer being grown in Europe. Well, most likely that would have been because they were grafting it, and a grafted one can throw more coarse growth and possibly throw some reversions. Now, I found kind of interesting because Lane Ziggins was friendly height and had a pair of them the same age. One was rooted and one was grafted. The grafted one was about 3 times larger than the rooted one. The rooted one was about, I believe about 3 feet tall. The grafted one was over 6 feet tall and twice as broad. And they're both the same age. Well, we were moving to Oregon in 1985, and we had a Buick Electra Limited, a 1973 model. And we didn't really want to move that to Oregon with us. And I didn't really just want to sell it because you couldn't get that much money for one of those big boats in the 1980s. But it turns out that Lane really liked the big cars. He always tried to own a Cadillac or a Buick. He liked to use them like pickup trucks. He'd take the back seat out and haul plants in the back and in the trunk. He'd actually B&B plants, and he could get as many as 20 bulb and burlaps arborvitae in the back of his old Cadillac. And so I talked to Lane about doing a swap. I asked him if he would trade me 5 of his old stock plants for the Buick. And he agreed to it right away because his Cadillac was no longer running. And one of the plants I got from him was the Picea abies Ellwangeriana. And I got the rooted one. I did not want the grafted one. And I grew that at Synosian Gardens when we owned Mitch Nursery. And I had to leave it there when I gave up the nursery. So I don't know what, I don't know what it became, but it was an excellent plant. If you want something that's going to be very dwarf and tight, a rooted specimen of Ellwangeriana is a nice choice for the garden. You don't get a lot of spruce that are narrow uprights and very slow. I visited Lane a few years later, and the Buick was in his lower field. It had broken down, and he wasn't able to get it repaired. And there's a homeless person living in it. One thing about Lane, he was a bit of a soft touch. And when we sold our collection in the height and moved to Oregon, Lane took charge of the digging of the collection for Martyrs on Long Island. And Lane trained some guys to help him do the digging. And one of the guys he trained to help him was a very hard worker, but evidently he had trouble hanging on to a job, and he was homeless, so Lane left to move into the Buick. Now, the Picea abies Ellwangeriana is talked about on page 31 in my volume 1 book on special conifers. And there's not too much additional to it. One thing about this particular book, the special conifers, I do more of a plant description and not so much of a story behind the plant. The stories are more so in my small conifer book. Now, another interesting dwarf form, and I'm doing these in alphabetical order, is Picea nidiformis. Picea nidiformis I talk about on page 134 in small conifers. Now, Nidiformis has always been a very common spruce. It's common because it roots easy, and nurseries can grow it, and it makes a gallon container fairly quick. Now, I thought it was going to stay very dwarf, very small, and I did plant one at our new house in 1974. It was discovered in 1904, and it got its common name, bird's nest spruce, because it tends to have a depression in the center, because all the branchlets grow upward at a 50-degree angle, radiating outward from the center, and the tips of the new shoots tend to droop a bit. Now, I realized when I was over at Kalmthoop Arboretum in Belgium in the 1980s, just how large Nidiformis can get. There's a very large specimen. I had a picture of it earlier in this video, which must have been at least 6 feet high and 15 feet across. Of course, it's over 100 years old, but still, dwarf conifers do grow, and they do eventually get large, but that was really quite large. And then there's another plant, Tabuliformis, Picea tabuliformis, which grows similar to Nidiformis, except the branchlets tend to develop layers. You get these layers of branchlets in the plant. It can also be rooted, but it's very hard to find because it does not root as easily as Nidiformis. Now, Tabuliformis was found about 40 years before Nidiformis. Tabuliformis found in 1865. And I talk about Tabuliformis also on page 134 in small conifers, the same page where I talk about Nidiformis. And if to show the difference between the two, and Tabuliformis, definite layering. And I saw a real old specimen of Tabuliformis growing in the Hilliard Arboretum back in the 1980s. And I had my picture taken crouching down inside the plant. That's how big it can get, even though it's considered a dwarf conifer. But there again, it's over 100 years old. The Hilliard Arboretum has a lot of old, very old conifers. Now, the Nidiformis I mentioned in Special Conifers in the Hornibrook article, and I cover it on page 36, and I have a picture of the one at Kalmthoop with some people around it to show the size and just how big it is. But it's very common, and you can find almost any garden center. Big box stores tend to carry it. And I talk about Tabuliformis also on page 42, and how the layers that tend to overlap, and have a picture of myself crouching down inside the plant. Now, taking a little bit out of order, there's Picea abies Pumila Nigra, which becomes globose, and it was first described as Picea abies pumila, as having like sea green foliage. But there is no such plant around. It's never been identified in this country. All the plants in this country have dark green foliage, and they're actually Pumila Nigra. And I describe it on page 138 in my small conifer book. And the Pumila Nigra, it becomes convex as it ages, and it's grown by a number of nurseries, especially since the 1970s, because it roots easy. Isley Nursery in Oregon used to propagate them by the thousands, and I think they probably still do. It's a very dependable plant. It stays very tight, makes a nice convex shape in the garden. And I actually saw a real old specimen at Blydenstein Pinetum in Holland, which must have been about 15 feet across, but it's 150 years old. An ancient plant. One of the things about Pumila Nigra is it is the epitome, or the apex, of an example of why you should not graft some varieties of Picea abies, or some cultivars of it, let's say. When you graft Picea abies Pumila Nigra, it'll grow up to a foot a year, and it just loses all shape. Remember when I was visiting Isley Nursery, John showed me a plant he had grafted on the standard, because Picea abies Pumila Nigra is really an attractive plant. So he thought it'd make a great standard. So I had some done on standards, and they just lost all character. They just bolted. Look, they were terrible. You cannot graft Pumila Nigra. You have to root it. Now there's another dwarf one, a little bit like Pumila Nigra in growth habit, called Picea abies Maxwellii. Now Maxwellii, I talk about on the same page as Pumila Nigra in my small conifer book, on page 138. Maxwellii is very distinctive foliage, and I always liked Maxwellii. I saw some real nice old specimens at the Arnold Arboretum and at the National Arboretum. Very dense, growing about an inch a year. The foliage was kind of coarse and somewhat curved, needles. The shoots are rather thick when they come out as young shoots, and it makes a very distinctive plant. The shoots tend to be a little bit faster growing around the edges of the plant, a little bit slower growing toward the center. Now there's another form of this called Pseudomaxwellii. Pseudomaxwellii is one that looks like Maxwellii with the foliage, but grows quite a bit faster and becomes much taller than Maxwellii. I think what happens is if you propagate Maxwellii, the faster shoots, by grafting, you're going to tend to speed it up a bit and produce these Pseudomaxwellii. Where I talk about Maxwellii in my special conifer book, I mentioned what Hornibrook thought of it, and it's on page 34 in my special conifer book, volume 1. It was introduced about 1860 by the Maxwell Brothers nurseries in Geneva. Now, Hornibrook, writing his conifer book, he said Maxwellii was not found in Europe, and he believed the ones who were labeled Maxwellii in Europe were actually Picea abies Beisneri and Picea abies Pseudomaxwellii. He did not believe that Maxwellii was in Europe when he wrote his book. It originated in Geneva, New York at the Maxwell Brothers nurseries. Now, when I moved to Oregon, I must have taken 10 of these with me. It was one of my favorites. And I planted them at the nursery in Oregon, when we owned Mitch Nursery, put them back in the Arboretum, and they lost all character. They all became Pseudomaxwellii, fast-growing forms of that one. It seems that Maxwellii just cannot be grown in the Northwest as Maxwellii. It just loses its character. If anything, it's too happy. And it didn't matter if I rooted them or grafted them. They just grew way too fast. So it is not a good plant for the Northwest, which is unfortunate. And I think it's hard to find because nurseries in the Northwest can't grow it without it bolting. And so if you want to get a good Maxwellii, you have to actually get it from someone in the Northeast who's growing it. Because it just doesn't grow as fast in the Northeast, provided they're working with the shorter shoots. I mean, I even went back to the National Arboretum and got cuttings after I moved to Oregon, propagated them by grafting and rooting, and had them do the same thing. So I just could not grow Maxwellii in the Northwest. Now, those are some dwarf forms of Picea abies that I cover in 2 of my books. Normally I won't hit 2 books at the same time, but these plants are covered in both of these books, Small Conifers and Special Conifers, Volume 1. They're nice plants. They're older cultivars, so people tend to avoid them, especially collectors, because they always want something new. But yeah, these are great plants, and if you live in the Northeast, you really should grow Maxwellii in your garden. And wherever you live, you should have a Picea Clanbrassiliana, because that is the true Clanbrassiliana, because I introduced it into North America as the true form. But be careful that you have the true form when you get it, and don't get one of those reverted ones. Anyway, I hope maybe you learned a little bit by some of these dwarf Norway spruces. I'll be talking about more of them later on in another video. So for now, if you're enjoying these videos, tell your friends or share them if you're seeing them on Facebook, and sign up for my channel on YouTube. If you're on YouTube, it's Synosium Publishing. If you're not on YouTube, then on Facebook, sign up my Synosium Publishing Facebook page. That way you always will know when a new videos come out, because I'm not going to be putting them up on all the pages like I have been. I'll be doing that for probably the next couple of videos, and then I'll stop, and they'll just be put up on my page and the Synosium Publishing page. Anyway, if you like them, make comments. If you see problems or questions, make comments or contact me through Facebook Messenger. But either way, thank you for your attention.